But I know we have one big topic that we're going to run out of time for, so we probably should move on.
Yes, let's move there. So last thing is you ran into this incredible breakdown of LLMs and kind of the future of AI, and on the Synthetia, I want to say. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
I'm saying that right, but on that platform, it was a very interesting view of where we're going with AI and what CIOs should be thinking about, frankly, even if it wasn't quite positioned that way.
Yeah, it definitely was not positioned to CIOs or to the enterprise at all. It was really talking about really this very broad question of, will LLMs lead to AGI? And you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation that OpenAI's stated mission is to effectively create AGI, and artificial general intelligence is this sort of elusive term that is being redefined, I think, as we speak. But this idea of super intelligence that effectively can, I don't know if the word is compete, but effectively be like human intelligence or what have you. And what I found most interesting in going through this article, and it's very deep and very comprehensive, and we can't possibly do it justice here, and I'm really curious to hear your take on it. But I think that one of my big challenges with all of this is that we've now reached this point where AI has become synonymous with LLMs and generative AI, and we all know that is, well, maybe we not all know, but that is clearly not the case. There's huge spectrum of AI. AI is this broad category, and LLM specifically. We obviously we've talked a lot about the limitations with hallucinations and what have you, but it's a very specific approach to it that has very distinct limitations. And what I thought was interesting in this whole conversation, in this article, it was an interview, is it sort of broke down these specific elements that I think, and I like I said, I don't know if we can get into it, but I think as a CIO, I'd be reading this and going, these are the things I need to be watching for. As I'm trying to figure out what my AI strategy is, this helps me understand where I can apply this and where it doesn't make sense to apply it. So I mean, I know there's a lot to it, but I'm very curious what your take on it all was.
Yeah, this breakdown of basically Yann LeCun thinking about AI. I took down a kind of four basic themes. One is an understanding of the world. Second is around persistent memory. Third is around reasoning, and fourth is around planning. And this story basically goes into all of the ways that AI is weak in these areas, and that's important. It's important to understand about the limitations of what generative AI does, because it's based on words, and
Yeah,
words
specifically that LLMs are weak in these areas. Yeah.
yes, because those large language models, words are very limited in what they represent from a data perspective. And yes, like I have a degree where I looked at semantics and semiotics and the power of words, but at the end of the day, words only take up a certain amount of data. Like you can listen to about 150 words per minute. 150 words is about a kilobyte, like a very small amount of data. Whereas if you think about a minute of video, you're processing via video and audio, probably something like 50 kilobytes of information, and then times 30 frames per second gets you to about a meg. Times 60 seconds, suddenly you're at 60 megs or 100 megs, and that's processing 1 minute of the world. You've basically streamed through 100 megs of data, and your brain has done something with it, versus 1 kilobyte of information of those 150 words. Like it's just a massively different amount of data that reality has compared to words. And words just aren't the entire picture of demonstration of the world.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I found that not disingenuous, but imperfect, right? Because that's assuming what it takes to deconstruct an image or an audio into
Mhm.
the way we would look at it, which isn't really the way our brain works. But the big point that I took from it is that LLMs are simply doing this like a one-dimensional view of the world.
Yes.
And we as humans, and I mean, I have a 1-year-old, right? And I'm literally watching this cloud and watching her explore the world. And she is doing with almost no language, and seeing how she's learning and how she's adapting. And so you can clearly understand that. Like I think we all intuitively get this. But the question is, well, what does it mean? How do we use this to drive strategy? And I guess before we go any further, we should clarify a few things. So Yann LeCun, who we're referencing with this article reference, is Meta's top AI scientist, and he and Meta are champions of what I guess you'd call a competitive approach, even though Meta has its own LLM, but they're champions of a competitive approach called joint embedding predictive architecture, which I don't know that much about. So he has a horse in this race, but he's making this point that LLMs are cannot have this true understanding of the world. They don't have all this, the visual, the audio, all these other kind of elements to it. As you talked about, they don't have persistent memory, although this one I don't entirely agree with. I mean, increasingly LLMs, at least I think, have the ability to come up with that. But the other two elements, which is this idea of reasoning and planning, are harder, although we're also seeing some movement around it. And there's another article, which I haven't finished reading, so I didn't share it with you yet, that I forgot what it's called, but something about how if Gen AI is a hammer, the whole world is not full of nails, right?
Mhm.
The same basic premise here. And I think that's the big takeaway, because I think if I'm a CIO today, the risk is that we're being bombarded with generative AI is everything, and needing a way. I talked about having AWS providing this framework of how you evaluate an AI partner, looking at the kind of the three approaches they're taking. I think it's a very useful help. Well, I think this is also a very useful framework as you're looking at the world of AI and trying to figure out your strategy. It's going to be really critical that you use these tools where they're going to serve the best, serve the most value for your organization. And understanding these sort of four limitations, at least as LeCun puts them out, I think is a super helpful framework to at least ask the right questions.
Yes, and I think the most important thing is that for synthetic AI, we are still at the point where AIs are basically best at managing closed systems. It's just that the closed system or the model for a generative AI is much larger than we've been taught to think about. The billions of parameters that go into a model and are processed every time that generative AI spits something out, it's a gigantic closed system, but the model still can't make assumptions that are outside of its experience. It just happens to have more language experience at this point to be able to auto correct and autofill intelligently, or with a more logical fashion that matches the way that we have traditionally looked at language. And that's a big step forward, but it's important not to mistake that for the model's ability to understand anything new or novel, or to make assumptions or think in the way that we do, because it still can't do that. It's great at imitating the way we think, but it still doesn't understand thinking the same way that you and I take for granted for looking at something that's new or novel.
And so to go down the whole where this article was intended to go, the whole question of AGI for a moment, just esoterically, to me, it is still an open question as to whether or not it ever will, right? And there's some philosophical debate as to, well, what does that even mean? Is there such a thing? Or do we in fact have those abilities, or are they just, can we in fact deconstruct it? And I think that it is a really interesting question as you sort of dive into it. And I think it's a worthwhile philosophical, thing to be thinking through. But as an enterprise executive, I'm looking at this right now and trying to be pragmatic. And what I loved about this is it gave me a framework to do that. It said, we have severe, there are very distinct and severe limitations with what this can do and how you would apply it. But it's hard, particularly for anyone who's non-technical, even if you are technical, frankly, but particularly for non-technical people, to kind of get their head around it. And this framework, I think, really helps you sort of break that down. If what you're trying to use AI for requires massive amounts of planning, you're going to probably have a challenge. If it requires this deep civil level of reasoning, you're probably going to have a challenge. If it requires, to your point, a worldview that extends beyond what you can capture simply through words, you're probably
Yes.
going to have a problem with it, right? And the fourth one, the memory, right? If it doesn't have that persistent, if it needs that contextual, and I think it's going to change. I don't know that the limits of LLM that in fact, I'm quite sure we haven't hit the limits of what LLM can do. And I think it's an open debate as to where that will play out. But I think it's a super useful framework when you're trying to evaluate it. And I think that's where we're all at right now, trying to figure out what are the use cases that make sense? How can I apply this? How can I generate value from it now? And how do I mitigate my risk? And so that's when I read this, why I got kind of really excited about this article, because I thought it was just so, in addition to being intellectually stimulating, it was very useful in how to frame it.
Yeah, and it gets down to this practical level. If you're thinking about IT, what is the maintenance going to be? How often do I have an idea of how to update my model, how to do these retrieval augmented generation capabilities, or fine tuning of the model itself on an ongoing basis? Because otherwise, for all the fancy schmancy stuff we're talking about here, what we've really got here is just another source of technical debt that I'm going to have to manage at the end of the day. Honestly, we're even seeing it now. Like older models of ChatGPT, they only go up to whatever 2020 or 2021. They just literally don't know what has happened in the last couple of years. And then the flip side is when you do see something that takes real life data into account, it often gets worse and less accurate because it doesn't understand context. It doesn't understand the world well enough. And so we're making all these balances right now, trying to figure out, is it more important to be timely or to be accurate within a closed time frame or a closed subject matter expertise? It's hard to tell where exactly to make those trade-offs, but we are making them, and then we are going to have to support these challenges going forward. Every time I
And
see tech, I just see technical debt.
and it's unavoidable. It is the nature of the beast. And I think it's a great way to close this out. Speaking of technical debt, my absolute favorite.